If you've been feeling an overwhelming amount of emotion over the past several months and not sure what to do with it, then you won't want to miss this episode. Today, my wife Téa and I break down one of the key exercises that we use on a daily basis to help us digest heavy emotions and extract the wisdom from them so we can create our life on purpose instead of living on autopilot. Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be sitting down with my wife, Téa, and we are going to share with you an exercise that we came to just the other day that we thought, man, this is really important at this particular time, and we wanted to share our experience with you so that you can then actually start to go through that on your own. Now, it might sound like I'm whispering a little bit because Téa and I have snuck out of the room in order to sit in the living room while the kids are actually sleeping. So this may be cut back and forth if they end up crying in between, but let's put out there that they're going to sleep throughout the whole thing. So I'm going to introduce my wife, Téa here. Téa, welcome to the show.
Thank you, honey.
And so this was really funny because we were sitting outside the other day.
Yesterday, I think.
Yeah, it was actually just yesterday. And we were sitting outside, and like I think probably most people that are going through this time right at the moment, a lot of people's buttons are getting pushed. Emotions are being triggered. A lot of patterns in our emotional behavior seem to be surfacing over and over again for us to take a better look at. And Téa and I were both having one of those days where it's like we were getting triggered with different things. And I remember sitting outside for a moment, just sitting with this feeling. And then Téa came out and she was sitting with a certain feeling too. And so I'll kind of take you through the whole story. But for me, the feeling that came up with me initially was this sort of frustration, irritability, sort of edginess around stuff. And often found it if the kids were getting too loud, if it was getting too busy to whatever. And it's like, that's when I would start to feel short. And so I was sitting outside starting to allow myself to feel this sensation. And that's when Téa came out.
Do you know why I came out? I actually saw you from inside. I was looking out the window and I saw you walking around away from the kids to get a breather. And you had this look on your face. And I'm like, I know what he's feeling right now. I'm going to go join him and we're going to have a conversation about this and we're going to dissect it a bit.
And so that's exactly what we did. So Téa came out and we sat there and she's like, what are you feeling? And so I sat with it for a bit and I said, the feeling that I'm actually feeling right at the moment is this sensation of just like shorter, a little bit more irritable, kind of like I'm getting poked at with a stick a little bit, and my tolerance was starting to feel less than what it normally would be. And then Téa actually was saying that she was experiencing something very, very similar.
I was noticing for me, I was actually staying inside and washing dishes and taking my time to do some mindful dishwashing so I can kind of cool down and figure out what it is that I was actually feeling, where it came from, what the sensation was. So I was kind of sitting with the emotion of anger that had come up for me.
And so as we were sitting there just having this discussion, it started to, and as we were working through it ourselves, because we'll often, when emotions come up for us, we'll stay with them. We have certain processes that we do to try and get resolution from them, but also to milk out the important parts of it that we need in order to evolve and grow and not kind of fall into the same patterns that aren't necessarily serving us so well. So it's to try and make sense of what's actually going on and why and how do we learn from it so we don't keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so as we were sitting there, we started to actually break down this specific exercise which was sort of the process that we were going through.
Maybe it's useful to actually point out if we don't actually take the time to recognize and go through processes such as this one that we'll be sharing with you, what tends to happen is we go through our days constantly getting triggered. So whether if we're feeling irritable, if we're feeling depressed, if we're feeling rageful, if we're feeling resentful, all these things will come up on a regular basis for all of us because it's just part of having this human experience as we live our lives. However, rather than reflecting on it, getting to the source of what it is that's coming up and working through this process that we're going to share with you, we oftentimes tend to then project it onto something else or somebody else or a scenario or a coworker at work or an employer or a circumstance that we feel stuck in. So rather than taking ownership for what it is that we're feeling and trying to get to the heart of it, we instead oftentimes play victim to our circumstances. And as a result of that, we disempower ourselves, meaning that if we play that card regularly, we are just going through our lives being victims to our circumstances all the time. However, when we do take ownership for what it is that we're feeling, how we can actually process it, get to the heart of it, when we partake in such exercises and take the time to reflect, we are actually able to move through our lives, we found, in a much more empowered way. We don't fall victim to the emotions that come up on a daily basis, but rather we use our emotions to actually better understand ourselves, figure out what's going on, why we're being triggered, how we're being triggered, so that we can finish my sentence for me.
I think ultimately so that we become more of the creators of our life rather than just running through almost on autopilot, letting these same scenarios happen over and over and over again. And you'll see the same types of scenarios happen, and they often happen with different areas of your life too, but the same sort of underlying energy around it still keeps surfacing. And ultimately, it's not until we really recognize and then try to do something with it and alchemize the feeling attached to it that we can start to create something different, right? And I think most people, when they're not happy with certain aspects of their life, you want to figure out, how do you create something different? How do you start to experience life in a different way than what we're currently going through the motions of over and over again?
How can you choose something different?
Right. So you can choose something different. So when we were going through this, the process we broke down was basically just see it, feel it, love it, clear it, and then envision something new. And so we're going to break down each one of those pieces as far as what that looks like and how you can start to incorporate it. So number one, see it. This is essentially, from my point of view, this is when you catch that something's off. Because a lot of the times we run on autopilot with stuff. We just do. And these patterns that we often get into, and whether it's thinking patterns that create certain feelings or certain beliefs or behaviors, we just kind of run on autopilot, and these things just tend to happen over and over again. Seeing it is really recognizing when we've been triggered. It's recognizing that we are out of our state of balance or harmony, and something now is going on.
So essentially there's a strong emotion coming up.
And that you've now brought your awareness to the fact that something has been triggered. So that's the first part, is just to recognize when you've been triggered. And part of the beauty in this is that, like I said, a lot of times if we are just running on autopilot, so say somebody gets upset. I mean, a classic example would be if someone has road rage. So if someone gets cut off, they immediately get this road rage and anger. And then right along with that goes a whole storyline that fuels the emotion and adds gasoline to the fire, makes things worse and worse and worse. And every time we do that, we hardwire that experience even more intensely. And so the beauty of recognizing is that even just catching that you've been triggered and bringing the awareness like, whoa, what's going on? What's happening? I'm already putting a bit of a break in that unconscious pattern that I often get stuck in.
Yeah, so an example that I don't have to think too far to recall this one is if I'm feeling triggered by the kids. So we have 3 children, and 2 of our little ones are constantly with us all day, all night. And so when I feel like I'm snappy or irritable or short with them, that is when I know that I'm being triggered. So I see that as we go through these sort of processes more frequently, we're able to catch them much more quickly. So for example, if I'm feeling triggered by the kids and I'm sensing anger arise in me, the other day I actually didn't recognize it or want to stay with it until my meditation later on that night, where as I was sitting and going through my day, I had the recognition that I ultimately didn't feel good about my reaction toward my children at some point earlier that day. And as we practice this more and more, we'll find that we'll catch ourselves sooner. So rather than, a week later recognizing like, the way I acted towards my parents, for example, just has left this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. Or at the end of the day where snapping at my children really did not feel good, and it has left this feeling of tightness in my chest. Or initially when it happens, and I catch myself snapping at my children, I'll be like, oh, okay, I'm feeling something. I'll stop. And then eventually, upon reflection, upon contemplation, upon doing these sort of exercises more and more, I'll come to sense those emotions as they come up within me, and I actually won't react. There's a pause between the reaction, and within that pause, I'll choose a different choice. I'll choose to maybe step outside for a moment and take a deep breath, or I'll choose to go out for a walk while I ask my husband to take over and watching the kids. Or if I don't have anyone around, maybe I'll just go to the bathroom and lock the door for 2 minutes. I mean, you ultimately have to do what you can and what is available to you at that time.
Yeah, but it's a really good point. I think the key thing around that is seeing it doesn't mean it has to be right at the time that the event happens. But as long as at some point during the day you recognize what actually went on, you recognize that you were triggered, and you start to question it a little bit or remain open to working with it at some point in the day. And sometimes
some point in the day or some point in this lifetime.
But I think the game plan is that the more that we just spend time being honest with this stuff and catching what's going on and asking, and with a true intent to want to work with it and just keep doing better for ourselves, keep doing stuff that works better for ourselves and for our lives, that eventually it happens sooner. I know for myself, my emotional reactivity is so much better than it was when I was, a decade ago, just from practicing more and more. And there are lots of times now where I can catch it in the moment and breathe with it rather than getting into autopilot. So first step is to see it. That's recognizing when you're triggered. I remember Pema Chodron talking about it as almost like Shempa. So the term Shempa was kind of in one of her books called Don't Bite the Hook. And it was literally like when you get that first trigger that sort of fires something up, can you recognize that that's going on before you get into the habitual pattern that we normally get into?
Of reactivity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then the next one, part 2, is feel it. So what do we mean by feel it?
So rather than going on autopilot, like you just mentioned, and reacting, so either snapping at the kids or yelling at the kids or throwing a temper tantrum as an adult, you actually take a moment, take a deep breath, feel it in your body, feel it in your body. So meaning, for example, going back to anger or irritability that came up for me the other day, it was actually noticing that my ears and my cheeks were feeling warm and hot, or I was noticing that my heartbeat had picked up its pace, was accelerated. And I just, going into your body, taking a few breaths, because your breath will take you into your body and you're ultimately wanting to go back to feeling. So feel it.
Mm-hmm. And a key part about this is that feeling means not thinking. So it means separating from the thoughts, because as soon as you get a strong feeling, your brain wants to kick in and it wants to go down a habitual storyline of either some sort of negative future fantasy spiral or whatever it does to justify the feeling that we've got. It's just sort of human nature. That's what we do. But we have to separate. So I always say, whoa, that's thinking. Park that over there. Thanks for playing. Let me come back and just focus in on what's going on in my body. Does my chest feel tight? Does my arms feel heavy? Do I feel my breath change? Does it get shallow? Do I have aches or pains that start to flare up? This is a really important one. So many times when people get muscular aches and pains or sore shoulders or sore backs or sore necks or headaches, just check in, because so many times those things will be a result of a situation that just happened where we got emotionally triggered. So feeling it is definitely stepping back and just getting into the body. And we spend so much time in the head that we're not used to spending a lot of time in the body. And the reality is a lot of times we don't like the sensation of the body, so we tend to avoid it. But this is just stepping back and going, okay, let me just get to know this feeling that's arising. So if it's anger that got triggered, then you step in and go, okay, let me feel anger. What does anger feel like? Let me get to know this better.
And what I did that was really useful when I started doing this, this practice, is I was so disassociated from my body. I didn't even know where to start. So when I received the guidance of feel it or get into your body, I didn't know exactly what that meant. I would think about getting into my body. I would recall the instructions, but I didn't know how to exactly get there. So something that I found to be useful was actually using my hand. There's a lot of sensory receptors throughout our fingers and our hands. So as soon as you place your hand on a particular part of your body, right away you're able to actually be much more aware of sensation in that particular part that you're touching with your hand. So you can even scan your body that way. Just even bring your hand onto your cheek or onto your jawline. Notice if you're clenching there. Bring your hand then onto your throat. Does it feel tight or does it feel heated there? Move your hand down towards your chest around the heart region. What does it feel like there? Does it feel congested? And as you move your hand along your body, scanning your physical body this way, breathe, take a few breaths and notice how breath is circulating through that area, and that will give you a good indication of, does it actually feel tight? So does the breath feel tight and congested or open and expansive? You can then move your hand through your solar plexus. What does it feel like there? Does it feel like you've been punched in the gut, or does it feel relaxed? Move your hand a little bit lower in your stomach. Are you even breathing in this area? So that I found to be helpful. And legs as well. Is there sensation in your legs, or have you disconnected totally from your lower body, from your roots, your connection to the ground, to the earth? So that I found to be helpful, and maybe it'll serve you as well.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that comes up when we think about feeling it is that when you first get triggered by a certain emotion, a lot of times I think of emotions like this cauldron that's just been building up over years, decades, lifetimes, and it just starts to bubble all over. So sometimes it's hard to really identify what exactly we are feeling. But if you can identify what the first one is, don't be surprised that if in the process of staying with the feeling and allowing yourself to feel it, it changes. It's not uncommon. Like for me, when we did this exercise, it started with a feeling of irritability and kind of anger and frustration. That was the original feeling. But
emotion. That was the original emotion.
Yeah, that was the original emotion. The difference between emotion and feeling, just to clarify, is feeling is just the sensation in the body. Emotion is when we sort of attach more of a meaning that we have to what that feeling represents. And so the emotion that I was feeling at the time was anger and frustration, irritability. But as I sat with it, and got to know what that felt like, it morphed into something else. And what started to surface then was more of a feeling of unworthiness. That was actually at the root of this feeling. And then that allowed me to go to a deeper level of it. And I remember in a book called Letting Go by Dr. David Hawkins, he talked about the key with letting go of these sensations and feeling it is to let go of the resistance to feeling whatever wants to surface. And a lot of times we have resistance to feeling what's coming up. But if we can just allow what's surfacing to surface and stay with it, be present with it, and don't make it into more with thoughts, things change and shift. And that's where a lot of times we get these aha moments around stuff, because things allow to start to alchemize. They start to dissolve. I think of it as like the neurochemistry of the emotion is actually being metabolized, and that cauldron is just getting lower and lower and lower.
And even, one of the benefits of our current state of affairs right now is that many of us do actually have the more of the time and space to be able to have these feelings and be able to stay with them. So oftentimes we deem feelings to be inconvenient because we're too busy, or we have to get to work or put in a long day of work and rush home and watch over our kids. And it's not to say that some of us are still not conducting our lives that way, but it's really important to figure out ways in which we can create more space and time. So oftentimes that even requires some reevaluating of how we've lined up our life, how we're living our life, what our current schedule is like. And if we don't have time to feel and be with feeling and sensations and emotions, then I think that's actually something we need to look more closely at. And because it's really important to show up for ourselves and to show up for the feelings that do surface. We've seen this over and over again, myself within yoga studios and workshops and retreats, and Jason too has witnessed this in a clinic setting. If we don't make time to show up for ourselves and to be with our emotions and the sensations that accompany it, then our body will actually create the circumstance for it to go into some sort of a shutdown or emergency state for us to create that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, more common than we think. That even I think of pain, whenever I start to get any kind of aches or pain, my first thought is trying to connect if it's related to something higher up than just physical. Is it related to any kind of emotional turmoil that I'm experiencing or that I'm processing, or into certain thinking patterns? Because chances are those usually precede what we experience physically. Not to say you can't have physical stuff too, but they are so intermixed. It's really always important to take a look at those things first. And then the third one is love it. Now that one sometimes is a tricky one for people to actually love themselves, because I feel like when we talk about some of these different things, that these emotions that surface that we work with, there's a lot of core ones that really, as humanity, we all deal with certain core ones at some point, or at least many points throughout our lifetimes. And I would say issues around worthiness and self-worth are at the core of it. Feelings of unlovability are often there. Feelings of abandonment are always on there too. These are all really core ones that we often tend to
universally.
Yeah, universally, we all deal with these at some point. And sometimes we have these other emotions that pop up first to try to almost protect us from getting to that layer that's really at the core of it. So don't be surprised if you sit with something that's maybe with anger or grief or something, and then you kind of find that it drifts down into some of these other things that are more at the core of it. But so loving it. So I'll tell you my practice that I do with this, because sometimes this can be a hard one. A lot of times we often show our love to other people, but we're not always that loving to ourselves. And so what helps me is when I've got a certain emotion that's come up and I'm working on this section of it after I felt it, and now I'm starting to allow myself to love it. How I do it that makes it easiest for me is I picture myself with that emotion as myself as a little child. Because the reality is most of the patterns that we run into were likely ingrained somewhere between birth to 7 years old. During that time period, we are literally running in almost a hypnotic type of brainwave state. We are primarily in this alpha theta brainwave state where information just goes right in unconsciously, and so many of our patterns get developed during that period of time.
No filters.
There's no filters. And most of the time, the emotions that we develop are a protective mechanism that we as a child have figured out to try to protect ourselves because we don't really have a big tool belt on how to deal with life. And so what happens though is that those patterns tend to carry on over time into adulthood. And so I always have this visualization, almost like a meditation, where I picture myself seeing myself as a child, or sometimes.
How old are you as a child when you picture that?
I'm usually around 6 or 7. And at least that's what picture means. And sometimes what I do now is if I have a hard time ever picturing myself, I will picture one of my kids as at their age. Like my kids are 3 and 4 right now. So I'll picture them being right now as if they're the ones going through something. And it allows me to open up my heart and feel compassion very quickly. But I actually picture talking to myself and saying, thank you so much for protecting us in the way that you knew best how to, with the skill set that you had at that point in time. But now I'm older and I'm wiser and I've got more tools and I've got different ways to deal with this that are going to be serving me even more than what we did back then. So thank you so much. I picture myself giving myself a hug, and it allows me to really feel like I am not only just loving myself, but even being grateful for myself for doing the best that I could at that point in time. I think that is ultimately what we are always doing, is the best we can with where we are. And as we learn more, we can do better. That's kind of the whole goal, I think.
So what I do, this was really, really challenging for me when I started to partake in such practices, because it made me realize that I actually did not like myself at all. And what the catalyst for me actually even wanting to partake in such processes and do better and be better were giving birth to my child, my first child. And my son is 16 years old now. His birth created a massive catalyst for me to start to shift the direction in which my life was headed. And through the recognition that I did not love myself, I knew that I had to change my ways, because I knew that I had this young child looking up to me. It might sound cheesy. I don't even know if I've shared this with you, but I would actually come home from work and have prepared dinner, and after homework and close to bedtime, I would hold my son at bedtime and I say, okay, wrap your arms around yourself. And I would do the same to myself. I say, give yourself a hug and say, love you, love you, love you, love you, love you, love you, love you. Like, it sounds so cheesy, but that was my starting point. And then as I would lie in bed, this was a process, right? This is something that I came up on my own to figure out, okay, how can I show up for myself? How can I begin to love myself? Where do I begin? It hasn't been role modeled to me. I haven't seen it, within my family. And so where do I begin? And that's where I began. I just started to wrap my arms around myself every night and started to sing songs to myself that I loved myself. And even as I would drift off to sleep, I would say to myself, I love you. I'm going to start now. I'm going to figure out a better way to treat you and show up for you on a daily basis. And I started there. And now I don't have to visit the child anymore, which I did initially, because it was really hard for me to show up for this grown-up version of me that was not as cute and lovable, I felt like at that time, as it would be to show up for the child version of me that I could still see the innocence of. But over time, right now I'm able to fully show up for myself and actually really appreciate myself.
Nice. Yeah, I think the most important part of that is just this willingness to show up for yourself, this willingness to actually love ourselves despite how simple and basic that sounds.
So again, just to review so far, see it. So recognize it when you're feeling triggered. Notice that something has come up. Notice that you're getting hooked into something. Second, feel it. So pause for a moment whenever you can, either right then and there when you're feeling triggered, or at the end of the day, or at some point when you recall the incident. Feel it. So take a moment, take a deep breath, get into your body. That emotion of anger, irritability, reactivity, whatever emotion that initially triggered you, that came up for you, what does it feel like within your body? So where are you feeling it within your body as you recall that particular circumstance, if you're remembering it at a later time, or if you're catching it right then and there, where do you feel it? Where do you sense it in your body, in your physical body? And third, love it, meaning that feel yourself experiencing the anger. Recognize that there is a sensation of anger felt as heat somewhere in your body, or felt as tightness somewhere in your body, or whatever that might be, however which way it might be showing up for you. And can you lovingly show up for it? Lovingly show up for it. I also think of my grandma. She was my nurturer. So when I was born, my mom was off to work shortly thereafter my birth, and it was my grandma primarily that took care of me. So when I think of showing up and loving an emotion, I think of this like grandmotherly love that I have the capacity to tap into and just nurture myself with that same sort of lovingness, unconditional love. So feeling your sensation, your emotion, and just showing up for it with love.
It's a good example with that with grandparents. It's whatever experience you've had that has allowed you to experience that, whether you felt it yourself or you felt giving it. Sometimes what I find is an easy one too is if you've got a really cherished family pet. Family pets don't push a lot of buttons for people. So sometimes you can feel like if you were to snuggle up with your little dog or your cat or something along those lines, could you almost picture doing that for yourself and almost generate that same type of unconditional loving feeling for yourself? And sometimes the initial reaction is like, ew, no, gross.
But it takes practice. This is why these are called processes. We practice them over and over again so that these processes become second nature. And they do. They alter how you react. They truly change the wiring within your brain. So your default then is not to go into reactivity or project it or shoot it out onto somebody else or play the victim card over and over again. But your default will, with this sort of process, will eventually land you into a place of lovingness, unconditional lovingness for yourself. It can happen.
Okay. And then the fourth one is clear it. So personally, for me, I find that if I've done the first three steps, if I've recognized it, I've really felt it, and then I've loved it, a lot of times the clearing it already starts to feel like it's dissolved it anyways. And you can tell because there's not really any lingering sensation still sitting there so much. It really does feel like this weight has been lifted from you. So that's the sensation that you're basically looking for, is this release kind of feeling, or this relief that often comes with it, this expansion as opposed to this feeling of constriction. A lot of times when those things happen, I know that the emotion has dissolved. The other magical part that often happens when you do stay with the feeling is it's not as hard to fall into the loving part either, because when you stay with the feeling often long enough without getting caught up in the thoughts, you do often naturally fall in these places of openness, awareness, and warmth. So it starts to naturally transition you to loving it. And as you love it, I often find through the process of loving it, you can clear almost anything with unconditional love. It's the most powerful force in the universe. So in my mind, when we can connect to that feeling, the clearing, it starts to really go. And I've recognized what it is that I'm letting go.
That's a really good point, because oftentimes, even as children, for example, we might have not had the parental figure or the caregiver that would actually hold us for us to be able to process an emotion, a feeling to its end, to its conclusion. So what you're doing essentially when you're creating a space for feeling something and showing up for yourself to be able to feel something to its end, you're being your own greatest hero. You're being your best caregiver. You're being that parent that you have always longed for. You are showing up for yourself with unconditional love. And this is what we're doing now. This is no longer waiting for an authority figure outside for yourself to heal you or to fix you or to better you, but you're actually recognizing that you have the capacity within yourself to be able to show yourself fiercely, lovingly, and unconditionally.
Yeah, I love that. It totally brings up the picture of if my 3 or 4-year-old fell down and hurt themselves, and then they're crying and they come over, and my job at that point is really just to hold them and let them feel that loving connection, and that I'm there for them, and that I care about them, and I'm present with them, and I allow them to naturally run through their period of crying and being upset. And you can watch it transition so quickly with kids. And essentially, that's exactly what we're doing when we do this process. We are lovingly allowing ourselves to just be in that space. We are being present with ourselves and what's going on in our body, and we are not judging the experience at all, and we are giving ourselves time to allow it to naturally run through the course that we have often never allowed to completely run through.
That's really important. So not judging yourself, not scolding yourself for, feeling it for too long or feeling it at all or feeling these wussy emotions. I mean, we've been programmed for so long and in so many ways that we don't even oftentimes give ourselves permission to feel. And that's why so many of us have been disconnected from our bodies and our emotions. So this is a radical process to be able to reverse all of that and get into our bodies and give yourself permission to feel and sense. Because you know what? When you do, the emotions clear. They dissipate. They shift, they move, and they clear out of your body. They don't stay. However, if you don't feel your emotions, all they're going to do is they're going to stack on top of each other. And one day you're going to show up with some physical ailment or, heaven forbid, a disease and say to your doctor, give me a pill to fix this, whether it be antidepressants, whether it be a painkiller. I just don't want to feel it. I don't want to feel it because I don't even know how to begin to feel everything that I've bottled up for so long. So even then, it's not too late, but it's really, really important to get into this practice on a daily basis. And trust me, Jay and I do this on a daily basis. We dialogue with each other, or how I used to do it is journal all the time when I didn't have anybody to talk to about it. And that was a really useful way for me to be able to process my emotions as well. So that might be the way for you.
Well, and part of it, when you think about clearing it, if you do picture that these, and we do know on a biochemical level that these emotions, these molecules of emotions that Candace Purdett talked about in her book, Molecules of Emotion, they literally get stored in the body and they just keep building up. And this is part of what creates problems in our bodies over time. This is also what creates us getting stuck over and over again in the same patterns. So when we clear it, we're releasing that emotional burden and we're opening up the door to now start to have different experiences because we're giving ourselves more space. Think of it in your attic. You clear out your attic and all of a sudden you got a whole bunch more room to put something new in there. So, which takes us right to the last step, which is envision something new, because you cannot envision something new if you're cluttered with all of the old stuff. It's almost impossible. You can't get out of the loop of thinking and habituating on the same things over and over again. When you clear it and you dissolve it and you transform it into something else and you literally dissolves, the neurochemistry dissolves. Now you're not going to be quite so reactive and triggered all the time. You start to now have space to think, okay, now what do I actually want to do? And now, whether you do that at that moment, or a lot of times what we'll do is this will be something we'll go through again at the end of the day, And this is the fun part. This is where you get to actually
exciting.
play like a kid and get caught up in your imagination, which is probably the most powerful tool you've got for creating the life that you would want, is allowing yourself to explore and have fun with your imagination. And
We do this a lot now.
we're getting so much better with this, but it's like I sucked at this initially because my imagination was limited to the box that I had myself placed in. So sky's the limit was whatever the top of the box went to. And as I keep expanding my box bigger and bigger and bigger, my concepts of what I can envision and what I can imagine starts to become more and more fun and more expansive. And so this is a really important one to do. So if you've been triggered from something and you don't like the feeling, you don't like the patterns that are going on, once you've gone through these steps and you've cleared it and you've now got this sort of space inside of you, what do you want to fill it with?
Did we talk about clearing it, how to do that? So there's a lot of different ways to actually, just to go back to that for a moment, there's lots of different ways on how we can clear it. There is one strategy, for example, that Lori Ladd spoke about just a little while back, where you basically just come into a sitting position or a standing position or lying down position, whatever works for you, just a really comfortable position. And you envision the top of your head or the crown chakra opening up, and you envision the root chakra or the bottom of your torso, the base of your spine opening up. And so there, from the base, there's connection to the ground, connection to earth. And from the top, from the crown, there's connection to the sky. Think of possibilities. And with this beam of light coming in from the top of your head, shining, radiating throughout the length of your spine, down through the base of your torso into the ground, you start to focus on your breath. And once you feel your body settle after maybe about 7, for some of us, 20 minutes later, 7 breaths or 20 minutes later, whatever that may be on any particular day, you can imagine this hinge unhooking from the base of your torso and opening up towards the earth. And what you're doing is allowing that stickiness or the sensation that is jagged or sharp or heavy. And again, connect to the bodily sensation, whatever that may feel like for you. And just imagine that that's just clearing down and out from the base of the torso into the ground. So maybe we'll just leave it as that one, just so that listeners and viewers can focus on that one.
Yeah, and you can kind of find yourself. I mean, a lot of this is playing with your imagination to figure out different ways that make things work for you. And a lot of times when you have a very focused intent and imagination around something, you will be making things happen. So like for me, a lot of times I feel like when I connect to that feeling of love, I literally picture the energy of that emotion that was lingering, just breaking up and dissolving into thin air. And that feels to me like it's clearing. And then I get back to that expansive space that feels like, now what do I want to fill it up with? Which is what then we move to the envisioning something new.
Envisioning something new. So what is it that you want? What is it that initially triggered you? That might be a good place to start. So what is it that initially triggered you? And how would you want to experience that differently? So for me, if I'm feeling, for example, going back to that original or initial example that I spoke about, getting triggered by my kids on that particular day, I want a loving, connected, easy, playful, fun interaction and relationship with my children. And as I say these words to myself in my process, and typically I do these processes within my sitting meditation at night, I then envision that and feel it, like I feel it in my body. How would I feel when I am interacting and playing with my kids, where I can see them smiling, I can see myself jumping and playing around with them? What sort of feeling does that conjure up within my body? So not only seeing the vision play out in my imagination, but also paying really close attention to what sort of emotions and sensations is that bringing up within my body, and really kind of milking that or sitting with that for a few moments or minutes.
And this is where you see the benefit of everything that goes on in our lives, because it's not like you're just trying to get rid of all of these quote unquote negative things that we feel. But what we're really trying to do is they're coming up so that we can grow and evolve and learn more deeply about ourselves. That's really what they're there for. So when these struggling and challenging things come up that we learn to process, they help us, because something we'll ask ourselves all the time is like, okay, well, that's the contrast. That's the stuff we don't want to see. So it helps us get more clear with what we do want. So say it's more something physical. Say you are struggling with the discomfort that you're feeling in your body. Okay. Part of that is that when that discomfort comes up, as clearly as it's showing you what you don't want, you have to be able to flip it to try and get clear then on what it is that you do want. Because what most people do, myself included before, was that we tend to get very focused in on what we're not very comfortable with, what we don't like about what our life is moving in. And then we get stuck on that and we talk about it and we share it with other people and we complain about it to other people. And it's like all we do is we just keep this fire going and we keep ourselves stuck in that same pattern. What we really want to do is we want to recognize what's coming up with that so that we can then flip it to be more clear with what it is we do want. So maybe I want to have the ability to be more flexible in my body. Maybe I want to have the ability to do certain things that I feel like these aches and pains are restricting me from. Is there anywhere else in my life that resembles what I'm feeling physically in my body? So if my body is feeling limited or trapped or stuck or whatever it is, then ask yourself, is there anywhere else in my life where I'm feeling trapped, I'm feeling stuck, I'm feeling limited, whatever that might be? Those are really great questions to ask to see if you can bring up a deeper sense of what's actually going on, and then turn to say, so what do I want to feel? I want to feel free. I want to feel expansive. I want to feel limitless. Whatever it is, it's going to become clearer for you. The more that you understand what you don't like, the better you can understand what it is that you do want.
And that's an important point too, is oftentimes we talk and we ruminate and we play out over and over again the parts that are not working. And as social beings, that's completely normal to do, right? Like oftentimes we'll at the end of the day, I'll talk to my best friend, JJ here, about something that came up for me. And through that dialogue, through that conversation, I'll feel heard and I'll feel in a lot of ways held, nurtured, and also validated. Like he, for the most part, just shows up and listens. And I typically then go to, okay, what now from here? But it's really important to not get stuck in playing out your ailments or what isn't working for you over and over and over and over again. Like I can think of quite a few examples, and I used to do this all the time myself because it was role modeled to me by my parents, and they like to oftentimes just talk about the things that isn't working and hasn't really worked for them for maybe 50 years. And really, it's really easy to just get stuck and caught up in that and not really make any beneficial changes. And we're here to say that it's quite possible. I mean, we work with this stuff on a daily basis, and we know the power of transformation that can result from doing these simple practices regularly.
It was funny when we were sitting down initially talking about this stuff and thinking about this process. As we were doing it, a text comes in from my mom that was telling us that their apartment is being completely renovated, and the whole apartment complex is being renovated, and even their storage unit that is all getting redone. So they had to actually take all of their old bags and boxes and stuff that's been in storage for a long time. They had to take it out and put it right in their living room.
While they're getting all sorts of extensive work as well as plumbing done. And we laughed when that text came through because we thought, wow, isn't this the perfect analogy of what is going on a global scale right now, where all the stuff that we have felt and experienced, whether it be fear, abandonment, fear of death, fear of disconnect from each other, unlovability, unworthiness,
abandonment. I mean, you name it. Everything's kind of coming up to the surface right now for people.
Yeah.
And part of this stuff, when we are not able to go and do as many things as we used to do and whatnot, means it's all coming right up because we can't distract ourselves too much that we normally do when these things pop up that we don't like the feeling of. So it's kind of like my mom's text. Everything is right there in the living room to take a look at. So to me, I feel like here's the opportunity. If we can't go and do a whole lot of stuff right now, if there's more restrictions and lockdowns and everything, this is the time for us to pay attention to this. Don't get lost in just getting into watching media and Netflix and everything. Sometimes little bits of that stuff might be okay, but for the most part, this is a golden opportunity to allow that stuff to surface, to clear it out so that we can really get clear on what we want to be moving forward with. This isn't about going back to normal. This is about creating an optimal. So what is it? And take the moment to clear stuff out, because the more that this stuff gets cleared, I guarantee you, you will have more space to start to create the life that you're wanting to create.
That's really awesome. I remember even at the beginning of this COVID era that we're currently in, when it came up, I turned to Jason and I said, it reminds me of the analogy that we oftentimes use within our yoga practice, where you're trying to catch a reflection of your true essence in a body of water or in a pond, and the water is all murky and dirty, and you're not able to see anything other than old leaves and dirt and garbage that's just sitting there. So what this, I feel like, is allowing us to do is begin to stir the pond. And this pond has been stirring for well over 6-8 months now for almost all of us. And what it's caused this body of water to do is get all the dirt and the guck and the garbage and the dead leaves and the dead bugs to rise up right to the surface for us to be able to see it very clearly for what it is, to eventually be able to then collect it and set it aside so that we can catch a clear reflection of our own true nature or our own essence once again.
And as we all do that, the more that everybody does this, the more that we collectively open up the space for other people to do it too. And the more and more of this stuff that gets dissolved and cleared, I really do feel like we are opening up the door for this next phase of the evolution of humanity. So I think let's clear out what's there for us individually, and let's all start to create, let's just have fun with our imagination to picture what could be possible. And let's hold that in mind and see what we can start to move to. All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining in. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.